This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufall and Stephen Maresca.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufall, and as always, joined by Steve Maresca and Matt Fasaro. Hey, guys.
Hey. Hey, how are you?
And we're fortunate today to be joined by Linn Freedman, who's the chair of the Data Privacy and Cybersecurity team at Robinson+Cole. Linn, thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
So today we're going to talk a little bit. We've talked incident response a variety of times over the last, say, 6 months. And I think we tend to come at it from the idea of, hey, you've had an incident, and let's talk containment and restoration and all the things that come along with that. I feel a little bit optimistic recently because we've had a lot of requests for folks who are interested in doing, tabletop, right? So actually looking a little bit at that preparation side of incident response. So, Linn, we've worked together in a variety of ways over the last few years. Done a couple of tabletops recently. I think we're looking to do a little bit more. You want to give an overview on at a high level, really, today, what is a tabletop, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. So a tabletop is really supposed to be designed to take companies through a process of an incident and really show them that they're flat-footed, really. Show them that they're unprepared, that for the very chaotic situation of an incident. And they're very valuable because you can walk through all the processes that you would walk through in a real incident in a controlled setting, even though it's very scary. It's really designed to test your incident response plan, and it helps companies look at their incident response plan, see if it's practical and usable, and then use it as they're going through and responding to an incident that I present or that we present that they don't know about. And it's very effective in a controlled setting, but still very scary.
So you mentioned having an incident response plan. I think maybe twice when you introed this. Have you done a tabletop for somebody who doesn't have an incident response plan, or do you feel that's a real precursor before you even consider going down that path?
So I think that if a company is thinking about a tabletop exercise, they're a little more advanced, and usually they have an incident response plan. What I will say is, I believe it's very important for you to have an incident response plan to follow during the tabletop, because you're really testing your response, and it's much more organized and effective if you have a plan in place. So I would say, yes, you really do need to have a plan. And then once you have your plan, test it through a tabletop exercise.
Okay. So what are the overall preparatory steps beside incident response plan in terms of setting up a tabletop organizationally?
Yeah, so the incident response plan is obviously key, and understanding and designating your incident response team. Who is going to be on that team that will go through that incident and follow that incident response plan, so that you know who the stakeholders are. People understand their roles in the process. These are all ways that you can prepare for a tabletop exercise. The best thing is when companies try to get me to tell them what the tabletop scenario is ahead of time, and I go, nope, you're not getting that, because that's the whole point. It's going to be a surprise. So because a real incident is a surprise, you can't really prepare for it. You can prepare by having your plan and your team members in place to respond. Yeah, and you go through different scenarios, very different scenarios that are real life scenarios, so that they can see how these things can happen, how easy it happens, and then how they respond to them.
How long do they typically run? Should they be prepared for a few hours, a whole day, multiple days?
I think to start, and it's really a phased approach. I think the first one should be shorter so that you can really talk about the plan, talk about the team, talk about responsibilities, and then maybe go through one scenario. So I would say a couple of hours. The next one, I think you don't have all that preparatory work, so you can go to 2 or 3 scenarios. So usually I will start with a couple of hours, and then we can go to a 3-hour session. If you really want to do a deep dive with getting forensics in and doing an actual exercise, that's longer. That would be a full day. But to start, I think, to get the flavor of what a tabletop is, a couple of hours is a good way to start.
We've had a couple of discussions where I think we tend to work often at the IT space, right? CIOs and IT folks. We've definitely had requests of people saying we only want the IT people involved, and I think your counsel has generally been you want legal, you want HR, you want representation across the organization. Do you ever do any that are isolated just to IT staff, or do you think that's too limiting?
Well, I think it depends on the goal of the organization. I think any tabletop you do is better than no tabletop. That's for sure.
That's fair.
So, I've been in situations where they want it to be much more technical, and they start with the IT staff and then bring in others. I think ultimately you really, first of all, want to have all your tabletop exercises under the cloak of attorney-client privilege and work product. So it's important that you have legal involved, because you want to make sure that it's protected, because you're talking about your vulnerabilities. And then secondly, I think you really, in a true incident, there are so many moving parts that you need a lot of people involved. And companies don't always understand how important different parts of the organization are to incident response. Communications is key. If your website is down or your customers can't get access to their data, well, all of a sudden your help desk is getting a lot of calls. So you need communications. You need executive leadership to be involved. You need the HR folks involved in the event that there's employee data that's involved. So I think running through a bunch of scenarios is great, because you can see all the different people that might be involved in a real scenario.
Going back to the legal representation aspect of it, I'd really like to hear, for the benefit of our listeners, what risk there is in not having that participation, because we've spoken about it in the past privately, but I think it's worthy to share it.
Sure. So anytime a company is really talking about vulnerabilities, talking about paths that they would take in scenarios and in security incidents, talking about maybe some weaknesses in their plans and in their procedures, you want to protect that in the event that down the road there's an incident and a company gets sued, because all of the information, discovery and litigation can be very, very broad, and part of that could encompass your preparation for a security incident. What policies and procedures did you have in place? Did you test? Did you audit? Were there findings? All of these things ultimately may be discoverable in litigation. And usually, if you're upfront and honest about and transparent about your weaknesses, if that's in documentation, it can be used against you in the future if you're in litigation. So at least having the protection, or trying to have the protection, it doesn't always work, but trying to have the protection of attorney-client privilege, work product doctrines, so that your legal counsel is involved and legal counsel is directing the tabletop, is very important for trying or doing your best to protect the entire conversation and the documentation around that tabletop exercise.
So even the subsequent follow-up documentation, I assume, right? The report that comes out of it, or whatever that format looks like.
Yeah. So if legal counsel, when I do tabletops, I am the one that provides the follow-up to the company for to make sure that it's confidential.
So you had made a reference, I think, at the beginning that you run a tabletop, and generally everybody struggles through them. Is it because of the way that they're constructed? Do you find that an organization that's gone through an incident generally is better prepared? Give me a sense of have you had one that you feel like, wow, they knocked it out of the park, and we just don't need to think about it?
So there have been a couple that I think they did very well. I would say that most companies in their first one learn a whole lot. Many companies now have a cadence of doing several over a period of time, 3 a year, whatever, and you do different scenarios. I think that the more you do, the better you get. It's just like practice for a football game. The more you practice, the better you're going to get at your plays. And this is all about plays. So I would say that I've never come out of a tabletop where there weren't some takeaways and some lessons learned and some things to do. What I will say is oftentimes it's hard for a company to keep the takeaways as top priority. And that's why having a cadence of doing several a year, you'll find that when you're doing the second one, you're going back to see what the takeaways were from the first, and that people still have some things on their to-do list. So a cadence is a really good way to get better.
So actually, it's a really interesting point, because we see during an actual incident, right, there's always an interest in making security improvements for a period of time, 3 months, maybe 6 months. If you're doing your tabletops regularly, at least that keeps information security or data security in the forefront.
For sure. And, what you find is everybody has a day job, and then this is on top of that. And so it's easy for it to go down on the priority pile. So if you're doing the tabletops, your data security is going to be a priority, but also if you have a cadence and do several a year, you can actually tick off those to-dos, because the month before, when you're planning the next one, people are going, whoops, I didn't do that.
Yeah, hold them accountable. Steve.
Right.
I don't know about you, Linn, but I tend to find that, or feel that, many incident response plans, business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans are all aspirational, right?
And too long.
Right.
And way too long.
That there's the old adage, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. And I think that's essentially the main thing to underscore. They're living documents. They need to be treated like living documents. Tabletops avoid the, liability and the feeling of crisis that an actual incident provides, but it gets you the same outcome.
And you need to be able to take them off the shelf and use them at the time. I mean, we just looked at one that had to be 40 pages long, and I was lost after page 2.
Right. It's unusable.
So when you're in the middle of a crisis, which is what a security incident, let's say you're in the middle of a ransomware attack, which we're going to see a whole lot more of because of the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. When you're in the middle of that, you're not looking at a 40 or 60 page incident response plan. Right. There's no way. You need to know, what are we doing? You've got to have a cheat sheet. You've got to know who to call. You've got to know who's on your plan. And oh, by the way, if you have a ransomware attack and you can't get into your contacts, do you have your incident response team on paper somewhere with their cell phone numbers? I mean, that's like how nitty gritty you have to get when you're in the middle of a chaotic situation and you can't have access to any of your data. You need something that's workable.
Well, and it's so valuable. You mentioned communications, and I don't want to go down the path of all the right things you should do necessarily during an incident, but certainly on our side, every time we're in the middle of an incident, it's 50% communications and 50% technical, right? I mean, it's all about managing the expectations internally, managing customer expectations externally. It's complicated.
And most companies haven't actually walked through the process that they would take if if their customers couldn't get access to their data, if they couldn't contact their customers, if they couldn't do business, they actually haven't gone through the process of what they would do and who would be responsible for that. And that's so important, because when it really does happen, then you already know that. You already know how you're going to react.
And some certainly have, even with good intentions, taken steps to, they believe, make their lives a little easier, digitizing records, avoiding paper-based processes, and so forth. And sometimes you need to fall back on that. But if they're gone, there's no opportunity.
Right. Or if you're not in the office, right? If you haven't taken them home, there's a dozen ways that can be a problem.
Yeah, my tip today for all your listeners is, if you have an incident response team, get all their private emails and all their private cell phone numbers and put it on a piece of paper and take it home.
So that feels like a good way to wrap. I mean, that's a useful takeaway. And frankly, I like the tip that you made, which was simply just do a tabletop. It doesn't have to be wildly complicated. You don't have to make it more than it is. Walk through an incident, get a sense for how you might handle it, and then get more formal as you go on. So, something's better than nothing. That is for sure. Fair enough. So I think on that note, that's wise advice right there. Linn, thanks for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you. I really appreciate the insight. Hopefully, as always, people took something away from this, right? Have an opportunity to learn a little bit and can move forward. So Linn, thank you. Anybody who wants to talk more about tabletops, feel free to reach out to us at LinkedIn, Vancord. We're happy to have a conversation. We're happy to help you however we can. Linn's obviously a great resource, so maybe we can have a conversation in the future. Linn, thanks.
Thank you.
Stay vigilant. Stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.